Hi there, I'm Amy Costant. I'm Executive Director of Science Communication Network, that's SCN. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing awareness of environmental health research through the media. We work to increase the accuracy, depth, and quantity of news reporting on this research. The presentation today is tailored for media interviews, but it may also be helpful for legislative briefings, community groups, advocacy work, that kind of thing. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my slides. All right, so today we're going to talk about how you prepare for a news interview. We'll go over some of the tough questions that reporters typically ask when they're writing about new environmental health research. And we'll go over some tactics that reporters might use to throw you off guard and get you to say more than you want to. An interview with a reporter is a great way to tell people about your science and why it matters to their lives. If you're prepared, you're going to have a lot more control during the interview, and it's much more likely to turn out the way you want it to. An interview can be friendly and it can be conversational, but it is not a chat. You want to go into any interview with a clear idea of what you want the reporter to tell their audience. The reporter is your conduit to their audience. And to do that, you need a really clear, concise messages that are understandable by an intelligent, non-scientist audience. I think about my mom, who's really smart, but she's not a scientist. If she can understand it, my messages are good. And when you're talking about new research, your messages are almost always going to be what you found and why it matters to the reporter's audience. What you found and why it matters. Boil it down to that. You want to get the answers to these questions down to just a few sentences in very plain language so that you can repeat them easily several times throughout any interview in slightly different language, or you could sound like a robot. Repetition is how you signal to the reporter that these are the main points. These are the points you want to see in every news story about your research. And you want to think about the questions that you don't want to be asked before you start interviewing, because it is part of the reporter's job to ask tough questions. So once you have your main messages prepared and refined, you're going to want to think through before you start interviewing how you'll handle the toughest questions you're likely to be asked. And here are a few questions that environmental health researchers hear all the time. If you've thought about them ahead of the interview and know how you're going to answer, they'll be a breeze. So no matter what your personal beliefs are, you'll very likely be asked to weigh in on policy related to your research. If you're being interviewed on the science, think carefully about whether or not you also want to weigh in on policy questions. You're an expert on your science, but are you also a policy expert? The reason to be careful is because if you offer an opinion on policy, you might be giving up some of your power as a scientist because the reporter may assume you have an advocacy agenda or even that you're cherry picking to prove a point. But if you do want to weigh in on policy, and many scientists do, you want it to be as a scientist, not as an advocate. This is really important. Be sure your comments are solidly based in the science and let other people carry the advocacy message. The questions on this slide are really quite typical. Think through how you respond before you start interviewing, and you can say whatever you want, but if you're nervous about talking about policy or your institution doesn't want you to do that, here's an honest and safe response that works well. You could say, I'm not a policymaker and I can't tell policymakers what to do, but I hope my research helps inform policies to protect public health. It's true. You're not overstating your area of expertise. It's a very comfortable spot. Here's a good example from Dr. Christine Till talking about her work on fluoride, which is pretty controversial. Dr. Till wants her findings to guide policy, and she notes that there are indeed risks and benefits to be considered, but she doesn't tell policymakers what to do. She maintains her expertise as a scientist who wants her work to inform public policy. Now, if you're fairly senior in your field, you can take more chances. You can go a bit further out on that limb, as does Professor Ami Zoda in this video clip.
It's a complicated question, and I think a lot of these problems, there aren't simple answers because there may be certain uses of these chemicals where it's really hard to find a substitute. I do think they should be highly restricted in certain exposure pathways, especially where vulnerable communities are, being exposed. So if it was up to me, I would prefer not to be eating phthalates.
As I think we all would agree. There are personal questions. Reporters will often try to humanize their news story by including something about you as a person. Makes it interesting. Or they may want to see how seriously you take your own findings. There's really no right or wrong here, but it's important to find your comfort zone before you start interviewing. You don't want to be caught off guard on these kind of questions. So when a reporter asks, would you let your child be exposed to this? Would you move if this were your neighborhood? Do you let your kids eat that? A good, not personal answer that gets you back where you want to go, which would be your main messages, might be something like, well, it's not about what any one of us does. This is really a public health issue that affects all of us. So here's an example from Dr. Zoda being asked about her family's exposure to phthalates as she's publishing a paper on phthalates in fast food, I believe.
That's a very common question to ask the scientists what they do. Where possible, we try to eat low on the food chain. We try to eat fresh food, lots of veggies. And I think those type of practices are just a win-win for public health across the board, whether you're worried about phthalate exposures or obesity or diabetes. But I think it is important to stress that the problem of phthalates in our food supply, while there is a role for individual choice, and to some extent that can help reduce exposures, individual choices alone will not get your exposure levels down to zero. This is really kind of a widespread problem that really warrants a policy response.
Okay. Reporters are interviewing you because you are the expert, so they're very likely to ask for your advice. Mainly, don't give medical advice unless you're a medical doctor. It puts you out on a limb you don't want to be on. Instead, you can have mainstream facts ready. You can say, for those who want to avoid this exposure, here's a fact sheet from a science-based agency organization, and these are all excellent ones that have great fact sheets you can feel comfortable giving out. You also want to be prepared for criticism, and you do this by growing a thick skin, doing some research on what critics are saying, what you can expect, because reporters are almost always going to try to find another point of view to show balance in their story. Some journalists are just contrarians. They like to stir things up. So find what you're uncomfortable with before you start talking to reporters and think through how you're going to respond to those questions you hope no one's going to ask. You can check websites like American Council on Science and Health, junkscience.com. Often you'll see there the kinds of things you should be prepared to respond to. Up here on this slide is a fairly pathetic attack on both the scientist and the reporting journalist. Nick Kristof is hardly a pathetic journalist. Shauna Swan is a terrific scientist. The second clip here, quote, is trying to debunk years of peer-reviewed science. So you got to be prepared for this, even if you're at the top of your field. Now, there are a few tactics that some reporters use to pressure scientists into saying more than they want to. And this can shift the focus off your study's findings or your main messages. Sometimes it might just be the reporter's personal style, but once you're aware of these tactics, you'll recognize them and you'll know how to gracefully avoid them. Don't fill those awkward, silent pauses. The reporter might just be taking notes, and some reporters still write in longhand, so that's legit. Or it may be a trick to get you to say more than you want to, because human nature drives us to fill that void when there's silence and just keep talking. And we say more than we should sometimes. Don't speculate or hypothesize. It's really easy to be reported out of context if you do. Just tell the reporter, I don't want to speculate, but what we did find, and you go back to your main messages. Sometimes you'll get a call from a reporter who's in a hurry, and that doesn't mean you need to be in a hurry. You can ask, what's your deadline? You can make notes about what you want to say, but get back to the reporter when you said you would. Now, doing this, you may miss the story being in it, but that's better than being rushed into saying something where you haven't had time to think through. You can call the reporter back and say, I'd like to add something. And again, you may have missed the story, but still, it's better. Now, these tactics are sometimes called gotcha journalism, where the reporter catches you saying something you probably shouldn't. It really doesn't happen very often, but if you're aware, these tricks are never going to be used to your disadvantage. Just take a look at this tweet from Tim Murphy, who calls himself a gotcha reporter. So reporters are pretty good people typically. You can't fine tune what reporters are going to report. You can ask reporters to let you see your quotes before an article publishes, and often they'll say yes if there's time before their deadline, but they won't show you the full article, and they won't let you rewrite your quotes unless it's, say, a number or something that needs to be tweaked. You can also request interview questions in writing ahead of time, but not all reporters will do that. Not all of them can do that. And additional questions are really likely to come up during the interview as you respond to the reporter. So best is be prepared with your main messages and your responses to tough questions. And in some cases, you could say, that's not my area of expertise, or I don't know. Those are fine answers. Don't be afraid to use them if that's the truth. Overall, the media is an impossible communications vehicle to control. The reporter won't necessarily report something the way you want them to, and they'll almost always seek a contrasting opinion to make their story. But the media is also incredibly effective at bringing your science to people who need to know about it, so it is worth the effort. The way to have the most control you can during an interview is to be prepared with solid messages in clear, plain language, so you can repeat them easily several times throughout the interview, telling the reporter what you think is most important. They look to you for that guidance. Know what you don't want to be asked, have good answers for those questions, and share your passion for your work. Passion is contagious. Thank you.